of Steve started the recording now, and we're hoping to put the recording on the energy page of the Hope Valley the energy groups page of the Hope Valley Climate Action website. So if anybody's not okay with that, perhaps they could put that in the chat. And then the final thing is many of us will already be on the Hope Valley Climate Action newsletter, but if anybody's not, Steve was thinking it would be good to add you to that. And if you, excuse me, don't want that, again, let him know in the chat. And once we get started in a moment, I see most of you have already turned off your audio, but to stop interference, it's helpful to have the audio off until later on when we have questions. And so I think that's all the practicalities. It's my great pleasure to welcome Peter Rickaby. Peter Rickaby's had a long and eminent career in the sustainability of buildings, and I was looking at his biography, and he sits on many boards and chairs, and chairs some of them, and sits on other boards and groups. But the thing that is particularly relevant to us today, which I'm sure we're excited about, is that Peter was the technical author of the PAS 2035 standards, which, to remind you, is the retrofitting of dwellings for improved energy efficiency. And so it would be lovely to hear from him sort of the assumptions behind that and how that was developed and so on. And he's also helped in developing the Retrofit Coordinator Training Program. So I imagine he'll touch on that too. And so, yes, I'm sure that makes it particularly exciting to us. And then also to hear about how his vision is for these theoretical standards to operate in practice, you know, on the ground in the Hope Valley, is the idea that you get a whole house assessment before even doing a teeny tiny bit of loft insulation, or is there the idea that that's a bit exempt and things? So it's going to be a really interesting talk that I'm sure we're all excited to hear. So I won't carry on any longer, but over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Zizi. How am I supposed to follow that bigging up? Let's see how we go. Evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to you tonight, or to speak to you virtually tonight. One of the things I said to Steve when we first talked about this session was that I think that sustainability and action to deal with climate change comes from the grassroots. It doesn't come from governments, and it certainly doesn't come from big companies. So governments follow, they don't lead. So it's absolutely essential that we have grassroots community groups who will drive things forward. So that's one reason why I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you tonight and perhaps encourage you in your good work. So let me see if I can share my screen. You should be able to see my title slide now. Is that right? Yep, great, thank you. So the title I've given this talk is Decarbonisation Retrofit Managing Risks, because mostly what I've been doing in retrofit for the last 15, 20 years is trying to understand the technical risks associated with it and figure out how to manage them so that we can all do it. And that's involved quite a long journey, as Zizi hinted, along the way. So what I'd like to talk about tonight, well, the ground I'd like to cover really, is this. Why should we be retrofitting? Where does it go wrong so that we don't fall into that particular trap? What are the principles of decarbonisation that we apply within retrofit? Then I want to talk a little bit about a review that was carried out called the Each Home Counts review. And that led us to the standard that Zizi mentioned, publicly available specification, or PAS 2035, which I was indeed the technical author of, but really on behalf of a steering group with many people on it. And then I want to finish off by just talking a little bit about where we are now with retrofit quality assurance. And along the way, I'll try to make reference to things that will be of particular relevance to homes in the Hope Valley. So I thought I'd start with this little quote from Rick Holland, who's a technical officer at Innovate UK. And he was one of the people who ran the Retrofit for the Future scheme about 10 years ago, 10 to 12 years ago now, which was an experimental scheme involving 86 projects and 115 houses that were all deep retrofitted. They all belong to housing associations. We're all deep retrofitted and studied in great detail for the following 3 or 4 years. And it was one of the best ways we had of learning what works and what doesn't in retrofit. But Rick said, retrofit is not rocket science, but it is complicated. So that was kind of the key lesson, or one of the key lessons that came out of it. I'll come to some more of those in a minute. But why retrofit? Well, homes contribute 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions from the UK. We've got, at the moment, about 27 million homes. And we're replacing that stock so slowly, about 0.5% per year since 1945, that actually 80% of existing homes will still be standing in 2050. If we were to decide to electrify all our heat and hot water in all our 27 million homes, in order to be able to provide zero carbon electricity from wind power, for example, or the equivalent from solar or from nuclear, we would need 30 times as much offshore wind power or the equivalent as we have now. And it's taken us 30 years to get to where we are now. So multiplying that amount of wind power by 30 in another 30 years is probably not a realistic challenge. But of course, we wouldn't just electrify heat. We'd use heat pumps, which upgrade heat by a factor of, called the coefficient of power, a factor of 2.5. And that means that actually we'd only need 12 times as much offshore wind power if we used heat pumps to deliver our heat and hot water. And we removed all the fossil fuel, oil, coal, and gas appliances in our homes. But actually, even 12 times as much as we've got now over the next less than 30 years is pretty challenging. And the government's heat and building strategy only looks at about between 4 and 8 times as much. So there's a bit of a shortage there. What we do know, though, is that if we were to do retrofit of all our buildings, and particularly of all our homes, we would only need 4 times as much wind power, which is exactly what the heat and building strategy specifies we should be doing, multiplying the amount of wind power or equivalent renewables by 4 to cover our buildings, and by 4 again to cover electrification of our vehicles. So one of my conclusions from that is that there will be no zero carbon homes unless we do demand reduction. We cannot satisfy the current demand, which we are currently satisfying with gas and oil and so on, and some electricity. We cannot satisfy it with zero carbon electricity because we just don't have the time or the money to build enough wind power. So we must do retrofit to reduce the demand. If we take to make the arithmetic easy, we take our 27 million homes and pretend there are 25 million, then to do retrofits of those over 30 years at an average of about £25,000 per home, which is what those of us in the industry think is likely to be the case. That's a good average. It seems to be reinforced every time we recalculate it. But note it's an average around a very big spread from about 12,000 to about 50,000. But on average, 25,000 times 25 million retrofits works out at 5 retrofits per minute, working hours from now till 2050. So that's pretty challenging. And the total cost is £625 billion. Now that's a pretty eye-watering figure. And you may say, well, where's that going to come from? Some of it's going to come from government, but probably not much. Some of it's going to come from us, homeowners or occupants. Some of it is going to come from financial organizations. Some of it's going to come from housing organizations and so on. But across the whole of the community, we have to raise 625 billion. And if you think that's not realistic, I don't know whether you know how much the Bank of England spent on bank bailouts and quantitative easing between 2008 and 2014? Whether anybody knows the answer to that question? Nobody seems to be volunteering. The answer is 1,500 billion. So in other words, we spent in those 6 years about 2.5 times, or over 2 times as much as we will need to spend over the next 30 years on retrofit if we're going to get it right. So my conclusion from that is it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of the priorities of our communities and of our nation and of our government. Over on the right, you see some of the homes from the Retrofit for the Future program, which I want to spend a couple of minutes on next. Here are some more of them. Retrofit for the Future, as I said, involved deep retrofit of 115 homes and lots of learning, years of monitoring and analysis and post-construction reviews and post-occupancy assessments, and a panel drowning in a sea of data for 2 years. But what we found is that one of the main places where retrofit goes wrong is at the corners, junctions, edges, and interfaces. And I like to explain that by saying that anybody can stick insulation on a wall. Even I can do that. But actually, it's where that wall connects to another wall, or a floor, or a roof, or a window, where we can get it wrong, where it's important to get the details right, get the continuity right, get the airtightness right, and so on. It also goes wrong at the interfaces between the building fabric, the building envelope, and the building services. So is the heating capacity matched to the insulation level of the building? Is the ventilation system matched to the air permeability of the building? And so on. And then finally, and probably most importantly, retrofit goes wrong at the interface between the building services and the people in the building. If the people who live there don't understand what's been done to the home and why, and what's the best way to use it, and what's the things not to do, if they don't understand what's being done for them, and that may well be an issue with things like heat pumps and ventilation systems, then we might as well not do it. So it's really important that we view our homes as energy systems consisting of the fabric of the building, the services of the building, and the occupants. And we need to be able to interact with all of those. The other place that's critical where retrofit goes wrong is ventilation. And there's a famous saying from the American War of Independence, which was used by the American rebels to complain about King George taxing them, but they didn't have any seats in Parliament because they were colonies. And they used the expression, no taxation without representation. So a few years ago, the retrofit community in the UK borrowed that, and we retranslated it as no insulation without ventilation. And it's the maxim really of retrofit. If you improve the insulation of a building or its air tightness, you are going to be reducing the air infiltration and air leakage rate, which will reduce the quality of the internal air. So we need to ensure that we deliver adequate, deliberate ventilation as part of our retrofit, hence no insulation without ventilation. But we do know that, and we found out from Retrofit for the Future, that most ventilation systems in the UK are very poorly understood. They're poorly designed, they're poorly installed, they're poorly commissioned, and they're poorly maintained. And quite a lot of them get switched off by occupants who perceive them as noisy, drafty, and expensive rather than essential to their health, living in their newly insulated building. And then the final lesson really is that most technical risks associated with retrofit are related to moisture in some way. It may be moisture penetration, it may be rising damp, it may be condensation, it may be the moisture effects of thermal bridges and thermal bypass at corners, junctions, and edges, or it may be mold growth, which relies on moisture. So moisture is the villain in this process. And of course, what these buildings are designed to do is to keep moisture out as best they can. But also traditional buildings like this one we see at bottom right, with solid walls and lime mortar and so on, were designed in a particular way with what we call vapor permeable construction to manage the transfer of moisture through the building fabric. And we have to remember to respect that when we do retrofit. So I wanted now to suggest some principles of getting us to zero carbon when we're thinking about retrofitting. And the first principle is, don't make assumptions about current unknowns. We don't know the emissions factor for electricity in 2050. We might have zero carbon electricity, we might not. All the people who want us to have zero carbon electricity in 2050 produce nice graphs that show how neatly we get there. If you look at the Treasury's graph, which is probably likely to be a bit more conservative and realistic about it, they don't think we're going to get there. They think there will still be some carbon, some fossil fuels being used to generate electricity in 2050. So we may have some topping up to do. We don't know about the characteristics and costs of local energy storage, whether it be batteries in our homes or big tanks of water or local energy stores or even pump storage. We don't really have much experience of that yet. We don't know about the extent of hydrogen substitution in the gas grid. Lots of noise about that recently. I personally don't think we're going to see any hydrogen substitution in the gas grid because there are much better things to do with hydrogen than use it to heat our homes. And actually using it to heat our homes is very inefficient. So I think that probably won't happen. And then finally, we don't know about the extent of penetration of low carbon heat networks. This is not so much relevant to Hope Valley, but certainly in urban areas where there's been lots of encouragement from government for the last few years, if not decades, to build heat networks and start to use low carbon heat sources like waste and biomass to deliver heat into those networks. That's going very slowly, but there are heat networks being built and there are heat networks in existence and there are heat networks being planned. So in urban areas, at least, we may well have sources of heat in pipes in the ground very close to our homes, but we don't know. So in the face of not knowing those things, the right strategy is to adopt what my colleagues and I call a no regrets approach to energy demand reduction, or a no regret approach to retrofit, which involves energy demand reduction. We need to accept that decarbonisation and retrofit are not alternatives. It's not one or the other. Grid decarbonisation to deliver us with zero carbon electricity is actually impossible without demand reduction, for the reasons I explained in my little bit about the wind turbines and the 30 times and so on. We also need to allow time for investment in the electricity network, because the capacity of the electricity network on the house side of your local substation is quite limited. And if we start to put 4 or 5 times as much load on it by heating our homes with electricity, and we then put another 4 or 5 times as much load on it by wanting to charge up our electric vehicles, then the system will fall over. So there is going to be a process of investing in the electricity network. It's going to take some time, and I'll let you guess who's going to pay. We're all going to pay one way or another, probably through our even higher electricity bills. So there are some zero carbon principles I wanted to suggest to you. Some more zero carbon principles. The third one is we should really be focusing first on fuel poverty and then on emissions reduction. We tried to work out and sort out fuel poverty in the 1990s. The Labour government made a very good hit at it, but they were overtaken by huge energy price increases in the 2000s, the 2000s. But actually, cold households don't care about emissions. Some of you may feel the same way, actually. If you're cold at home, you want to be warm, and that probably takes priority over reducing your greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide emissions. So we need to make sure that we deal with the fuel poverty problem. And the events of the last few weeks in terms of energy prices, of course, don't help us with that very much. So the fourth principle is adopt the fabric first approach. And the fabric first approach, which is long established in the industry, says, number one, improve the building fabric and the ventilation in order to reduce demand for heat and hot water and so on, but principally for heat. And then number two, improve and decarbonize the building services so that we can satisfy the residual demand or the remaining demand efficiently and in a low carbon way. And then three, finally, use renewable energy technologies to top up to zero carbon if the grid hasn't quite got there. So fabric first is fabric first, and then building services, and then renewables in that order. And it makes sense, because if you insulate the building fabric, the capacity of this building services you need will be lower, and therefore they'll be cheaper. And renewables are actually quite expensive, so we want to use the minimum amount of those for doing our topping up, plus many of them rely on roof space, which we don't always have enough of to do it properly. So what we should be doing is establishing a staged whole house improvement plan for every dwelling, so that we know that how we're going to get to 2050 and which way to do it. Very few householders or landlords can afford to do their retrofit all at once. And so for the rest of us, it's going to be about stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 over the next 30 years, applying the fabric first approach and working at it in the way that one eats an elephant, in bite-sized chunks. So here's my zero carbon 1, 2, 3. Number 1, improve the building fabric. That means the whole building envelope, walls, roofs, floors, openings, and the maximum no insulation without ventilation. Aim to minimize or eliminate fuel poverty, and the current government target of Energy Performance Certificate Band C, which is SAP Energy Rating 69, if you know about SAP Energy Ratings, is actually inadequate. It doesn't deliver affordable warmth now, let alone later this year as the further fuel price rises kick in, and it certainly won't be doing that in 2030. So we need to be looking more at what we call the top of EPC Band C, which is Standard Assessment Procedure, or SAP 80. We probably ought to be looking at much more challenging standards like the Passive House Enefit standards for our retrofit, which deliver very high standards of comfort and very low energy use. But as you well know, in Hope Valley, there are some, if not many, traditionally constructed homes that cannot be adequately insulated. Quite often, we wouldn't want to put external wall insulation on the outside. We may not have the space inside for internal wall insulation. We may not be able to do roof-mounted things like solar PV or solar thermal, and it may not be appropriate to put a heat pump on the building. There are all sorts of considerations around construction, vapor permeability, architecture, aesthetics, appearance, and so on, and moisture management, which mean that traditionally constructed homes are very challenging to retrofit. So that means that we may need to be thinking about alternatives to insulation. And in some of my work with Savills, we're currently looking at whether we can not put external wall insulation on some smaller homes, mostly terraced homes, and instead use roof-mounted solar PV with batteries to do the job. I'm not sure we know whether we can do that yet. The numbers still don't quite add up, but we're getting there. But where there are dwellings that we can't adequately insulate, we may have to do deeper retrofit to other dwellings to compensate for not getting there in the case of the traditionally constructed ones. And it's very difficult because zero carbon means zero carbon, which means zero carbon everywhere. There's not really an opportunity to offset. We probably should be aiming for an average 60% reduction in energy demand across our housing stock. So if every house on average achieved a 60% reduction in demand, we would get away with our 4 times expansion of offshore wind power that's proposed in the heat and building strategy. Number 2, improve the building services and controls. As I said, that means focusing on heating, hot water and cooking. We will already have done ventilation in stage 1, and we've already done lighting, which has been driven by the EU standards. And we're mostly, I'm sure, I hope we're all now lighting our homes with LEDs throughout. We need to be removing fossil fuels, and that means for heating, hot water and cooking in particular, probably in most cases, individual air source heat pumps. I think that the heat pumps will get smaller and quieter and cheaper and more reliable and more efficient, but don't quote me on that, but that's what usually happens when we go for new technologies at volume and at scale. So I think the heat pumps we'll have in 20 years will be much better than the ones we have now. That might be a clue to working on your insulation in the meantime and coming back to the heat pumps later. Where we have blocks and small estates, communal ground source heat pumps are probably a better option. They're much more efficient, they're much less intrusive, they're quieter, all those kind of things. But if we're in some urban areas, we may have low carbon heat networks to connect to. And indeed, I believe that if we do have low carbon heat networks in urban areas, it'll become mandatory to connect to them when we build new dwellings or when we do retrofit. So what we're trying to do in this number 2 stage here is get dwellings what I would call zero carbon ready, because the grid won't be decarbonised until 2050. So we can get it to a point where it could be zero carbon by 2050 if all goes to plan. And then number 3 of the 1, 2, 3 is start using local renewable energy to achieve zero carbon. And this is probably more likely to be something that you can do in Hope Valley. Options will include solar PV systems, probably with battery storage. Solar PV doesn't have to be on every roof. It could be on solar farms or on hillsides. The battery storage doesn't have to be in every home. It could be shared locally. It could be water storage. We should be looking at solar thermal systems. Once we've retrofitted and insulated our homes and made them quite well insulated, then the biggest thermal load in our homes will be the hot water, not the space heating. And from solar thermal systems, roof-mounted solar panels to make hot water, we can get about half the annual demand, albeit mostly in summer. But nevertheless, why would we turn down half of our annual demand for hot water for free, except for the capital cost, and with no carbon involved? So solar thermal definitely has a role to play. And I think we need to be thinking about keeping some space on our roofs for solar thermal alongside the solar PV. And there are now solar panel companies, one called Viridian Solar, for instance, up in North Cambridgeshire, who make panels that look the same, but some of them are solar PV and some of them are solar thermal. So you can mix and match across your roof without making it look messy. And then, of course, there's community wind power. And community wind power is the only way to do wind power. Small-scale wind power is hugely inefficient, but community wind power is very common in many parts of Europe. You can do it locally in your village or shared between villages. You can do it remotely. Wind power doesn't have to be in your village. It can be in Wales or in the Irish Sea or wherever it wants to be, provided it's hypothecated, the output is hypothecated to you as the user. When you do use local renewables, you may be constrained by the available roof area. So one of the earliest analyses you need to do is, well, how much roof have I got? How much of it is shaded? How much is it well oriented? What amount of energy might I realistically get off the roof, either as solar electricity or as hot water? So that brings me to Each Home Counts. A big review, some of you may have heard of it, others perhaps not. It was brought about by a series of disasters in retrofit, which culminated actually after the review at Grenfell. But before that, there were some places, well, there were many dozens, if not thousands of places where really poor quality retrofit was being done, mostly with government money or government promoted schemes. And there were so many complaints and so many problems, it soon became apparent that bad retrofit was worse than no retrofit in terms of how it left people's houses. And so we had this review, an independent review of consumer advice, protection, standards and enforcement for energy efficiency, renewable energy. This was a review sponsored by 2 government departments, led by Peter Bonfield of BRE, had multiple work streams, and there were hundreds of people in the industry and around it who gave up 2 years of their time in many cases to contribute to those work streams and undertake the review. There were 27 recommendations published in December 2016. I'm not going to go through them all because I'm mostly interested in quality and standards, but these are the main headings of the recommendations, and they pretty much match the work streams actually. And then implementation's been going on ever since. You may think that Each Home Counts disappeared from sight or without a trace, but implementation has been coordinated by a cross-industry implementation board, which sat for 2 years. BEIS has supported it with more than £3 million so far. And slowly, we've been changing things. And I have to say, in some cases, with great enthusiasm from the industry, and in other cases with extremely negative pushback from the industry, many sectors of which wish to continue doing things the way they always did and making people's homes worse, not better. This is one of the outcomes of the Each Home Counts review. It's the BSI, British Standards Institute's Retrofit Standards Framework, which was one of the main recommendations of Each Home Counts that this be created. And it was set up by the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group. And this is a kind of diagram really of how it's supposed to work. Another recommendation of Each Home Counts was a quality mark for retrofit, and that Each Home Counts quality mark became Trustmark. Trustmark is a government-endorsed standards organisation. It's sort of quasi-independent, and the role of the retrofit quality mark was given to Trustmark. So government programmes, whether they're funded or promoted by government, are now required to be subject to Trustmark and Trustmarked in order that the customer, in theory, can have some confidence that the quality of the work will be acceptable. What Trustmark do is they're supported by a code of conduct, which tells the industry how to behave and how not to, and by a customer charter, which basically lets the customer know what they can expect from the industry and what they can't. It particularly deals with things like redress and remediation when things go wrong. Programs of retrofit that are Trustmarked are subject to PAS 2035, Retrofitting Dwellings for Improved Energy Efficiency, which is the overarching process standard for domestic retrofit. And essentially what it says is, you do your retrofit this way and you will avoid falling into the technical traps and problems which we know about and we've learned about through things like Retrofit for the Future. But the reason it's a framework is that PAS 2035 itself requires compliance with a whole load of existing other BSI standards. PAS 2030 here is for installation, BS 5250 is for moisture management, BS 7913 is for improving traditionally constructed buildings. And over here, non-BSI standards like the insulation industry standards, the microgeneration certification scheme, and so on. And the Retrofit Standards Task Group is continuing to add new BSI standards and PASs to the framework all the time. We're currently working on an assessment standard, an air tightness and ventilation standard, an energy advice code of practice, and we've just published a building performance evaluation standard. So this framework is a moving thing. It's a living thing that's continuously growing and being developed. And the point is that when something gets Trustmarked, every single good practice standard that we know of that's identified in the framework is brought to bear on that project. So it's a way of making sure that all government funded or promoted standards, programs of retrofit, which are Trustmarked, are subject to all the best standards from across the spectrum. This is PAS 2035. It's a bit of a daunting diagram, but essentially this is what the book looks like. And I'll just very quickly take you through the process so you understand where it's coming from. At the inception of the project, there is a risk assessment carried out. And that risk assessment is based on 5 criteria, and it determines whether your project follows path A, B, or C through the standard. A is low risk, B is medium risk for most projects, and C is high risk for traditionally constructed and protected buildings and high rises and things like that. At the same time, there is appointment of a retrofit coordinator. Every project has to have a retrofit coordinator, and we've spent the last 3 years training retrofit coordinators as fast as we can to get a good cadre of them out there. But we also have a retrofit assessor, a retrofit designer, and a retrofit evaluator in the process, all of whom have roles and minimum professional qualifications. Because one of the objectives of PAS 2035 was to re-professionalize retrofit after the government removed all the professionals and gave the whole job to untrained installers around 2010 at the inception of the Green Deal. So we're trying to put the professionals back. After the risk assessment comes a whole dwelling assessment, including an assessment of existing ventilation, and if it's traditionally constructed or protected, a significance assessment. That whole dwelling assessment deals with the context, both geographical and legal, the condition of the building, the occupancy of the building, the energy efficiency of the building, the ventilation of the building, and its architectural historical significance. Once all that assessment's been done, there is an improvement option evaluation run by the retrofit coordinator, and the improvement option evaluation helps us to decide which improvements that building needs to get it where we need it to be by 2050, and which are the most cost-effective ones to choose. Once we've got the improvement of our option evaluation, through advice with the client, and the client can be the occupant, the landlord, or the funding body, or all three, we create a medium-term plan for that dwelling or that dwelling type to get it to where we want it to be in 2050 in substantial stages, clearly planned so that things are done in the right order. So the improvement option evaluation is what to do to the building. the medium-term plan is how to go about it. Once we've got that, the first stage and all subsequent stages of the work can go to the retrofit designer, who is required to produce a detailed design for the job, and that requires account to be taken of things like construction, typical construction, moisture management, all sorts of things like thermal bridging, thermal bypass, and so on, and carbon, of course, and overheating in summer. So the design is produced, and that's then given to an installer who works under another standard called PAS 2030. That's the installation standard. So the installer installs the design, tests it, commissions it, and hands it over alongside some advice to the occupants. And then finally, under PAS 2035, there is an evaluation process which asks the question, have the intended outcomes of this project agreed with the client been achieved? And have there been any unintended consequences? In other words, have we done what we said we would do, and has anything gone wrong along the way? If the answers are good, then the project complies with PAS 2035, and there's a feedback report that goes back to the team. If the answers are not what are expected, in other words, the intended outcomes have not been achieved, or there have been unintended consequences, the evaluation process is escalatory, and there are stages whereby the problems are investigated and remediated as required. So it's a complicated process, but not that complicated. It's the rocket science thing again. So to kind of summarize PAS 2035, which is probably going to be with us for a while now, and we're just about to update it this year. We have a risk assessment, which determines the path through the PAS. We have a retrofit coordinator for every project. And we have professional qualifications required for the retrofit coordinator and for the other roles, depending on the risk path. We have requirements for design, which again depend on the risk path, but include an improvement option evaluation and a medium-term plan. We have additional requirements for traditionally constructed and protected buildings, where things like moisture risks are more important and where planning issues and heritage issues are more important. We have requirements to assess the existing ventilation and upgrade it if it's inadequate or will become inadequate because of the retrofit. We have an installation process that must comply with PAS 2030, and PAS 2030 requires installers to have certified competence. And then finally, we have an evaluation process to confirm that the agreed outcomes have been achieved and to investigate and put right any discrepancies. So PAS 2035 is quite a challenging document. It's been the subject of much argument in both directions in the industry. It's still going on, and it probably will for a long time. Lots of people pushing back, lots of other people saying we need to strengthen this thing and protect our homes and our occupants' health more even than we're doing at the moment. So to finish off with, I thought I'd just try and sum all this stuff up in a little diagram. I talked a little bit about Retrofit for the Future. We did a lot of learning from that and learning from the Centre of Refurbishment Excellence up in Stoke-on-Trent, and learning from the GLA's Renew programme, all of which were groundbreaking retrofit programmes. We also had a lot of failures, some thousands of failures across, some of them very high profile, some of them hardly heard about, but nevertheless failures. And that led to the Each Home Counts Review. The Each Home Counts Review led to the establishment of the Trustmark quality mark for retrofit, and all government promoted or government funded retrofit programs are Trustmarked. Trustmark has two arms to it. It has a compliance arm, which does audits of designs and assessments and improvement option evaluations and medium-term plans, and inspections of work on site, and enforcement, and deals with remediation and redress when things go wrong. And Trustmark also has a data warehouse, an online data warehouse, into which records of all PAS 2035 compliant retrofit projects are uploaded. But the main point from Trustmark is that projects must comply with PAS 2035, the one we've just been through. And PAS 2035, through the framework, calls in lots of other standards, so that we're bringing all the latest, most up-to-date quality standards for retrofit to bear on the project. And then for installation, we have PAS 2030, which deals with testing, commissioning, and handover. Or in the case of renewable technologies, we have the Microgeneration Certification Scheme, or MCS standards, and records of all that and of the designs go into the Trustmark data warehouse so that Trustmark can apply risk-based procedures for identifying what needs inspection, auditing, and so on. And then finally, all of this stuff in the grey box at the bottom is part of the BSI Retrofit Standards framework. So we started, if you like, with a rather messy industry where we kind of huge challenges in terms of what we need to do, not a lot of knowledge of how to go about it in a robust and safe way. We had lots of disasters and failures on the way, but we learned from various programs, we reviewed them, and we've come up with a structure which is not actually that complicated, based on Trustmark and based on PAS 2035, to help us to deliver now 27 million retrofits at 5 a minute over the next 30 years. And I think probably we're probably in quite a lot of danger of not achieving that anyway, but without this quality assurance system, we certainly wouldn't. And my final point is that I've been doing a lot of visiting recently to housing estates around the country, often central urban housing estates, which started life sometimes 100 years ago as very beautiful buildings, very beautiful terraces in many cases. And actually, I've seen quite a lot of them ruined by retrofit, externally in terms of their appearance and internally in terms of the environment they provide, because bad retrofit is worse than no retrofit. You end up with cold, damp, moldy homes because the moisture gets in where you didn't want it to get in. It might have been better in some cases to leave them alone. So we have to go about this in an intelligent way, and we have to go about it with care, and we have to make sure we apply appropriate standards. So I think I'll stop there so we can have some questions and discussion. I probably haven't made as much allusion to Hope Valley as you would have liked, but I'm happy to try and do that in answering the questions. So shall I unshare now? That's probably the best thing to do. Right.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly found it very interesting, and I'm sure many other people too. I'm going to, I know some people would have so many questions they could keep you going for countless great eons. So I'm going to allow each person 2 questions, and I'm going to set the ball rolling with 2 myself. My personal experience when I've had a build around and asked about Trustmark is that they've either said it's too expensive or it's got too many regulations, it's too bureaucratic, and so they're not going to touch it. That's my first question. The second one is, the whole system you describe sounds like it's aimed at big housing associations and councils rather than the homeowner doing their 3-bedroom semi.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's take those questions in order, Zizi. I mean, I think the truth is that the best way to deliver retrofit is with the local, what we call the RMI industry, the repairs, maintenance and improvements industry, your local builders working with local tradesmen of every type in teams to do the work for you. And mostly they're people who are local and you trust them and you recommend them to each other and all that kind of stuff. That would be undoubtedly the best way to deliver retrofit. And we're trying very hard to get those people to do that for us. I think it's probably the only way. My colleague Catherine Maybe wrote a report with Alice Owen from Leeds University called Installer Power, which was all about those people being the best builders and tradesmen we've got. The problem is that they're all very busy. They've got plenty of work. They're very well known in their marketplace. They carry on working. They don't really want to do anything new. And they certainly don't want to go away from their local towns and villages in order to be trained to do something new. So there's still an issue there of engaging those people. But what we need to do is to get the guy that you trust, who's servicing your boiler or replacing your window or whatever it might be, redecorating for you, to say, you should do retrofit at this point. There's an opportunity and I know how to get it done well for you. So we haven't cracked that one yet. And so it's not a good answer to the question, but there we go. The second thing is that actually I think the Trustmark PAS 2035 system falls exactly in between where we need it to be. It isn't really set up for scale retrofit by housing organizations who have difficulties with it because it tends to focus on one dwelling, doing whole dwelling retrofit. It's probably too complicated for individual owner occupiers, so we need to simplify for them. But it's not allowing housing organizations to work with dwelling types within their stock and to move forward at scale efficiently. So we're currently in the middle of the first big update to PAS 2035, which is trying to address both of those problems. How do we make it simpler and easier for the average householder, although it may well be that whoever funds the work will require compliance with PAS 2035 anyway. And then secondly, how do we bring in good tradesmen to do the work and get them engaged with it? Perhaps it's their sons and daughters who will engage with it when they inherit the business, rather than the tradesmen we've got now. But also, we're still fighting a big pushback from what the ministers, when they set up PAS 2030 in particular, described as cowboy builders wrecking people's homes, which is exactly what was going on. They're still pushing back and saying we don't do it that way. What we're trying to get them to do is do something that's a bit different, it's a bit more difficult, it's a bit more challenging, but it gives you a better outcome. And everybody who's behind each home counts in PAS 2035 is on the side of the householder. But some of those builders are on the side of doing it quick and cheap, getting paid and moving on to the next job, and never coming back to see what a mess they've made. So we have to be careful that we're pushing in the right direction, and we're pushing back as well in the right direction, or we're resisting the pushback, shall we say. So I think that's how I'd answer it.
Getting that balance between, as you say, the good local man who you can trust to do a good job but doesn't want to register, and the cowboy who also doesn't want to register because they can do it cheap and nasty. And it is a challenge. I can see that. So in the chat,
Cowboys' fault, ZZ. If the Cowboys had been being cowboys, we wouldn't have needed to set up the complexity and cost of this framework. Anyway,
indeed.
Go ahead.
So in the chat, Pamela asks, is building regs approval needed? Should local authorities pressure tested draft seals? Draft seals have been installed in our local authority estate of 69 flats from 1900 about, presumably when built, solid wall, double sliding sash windows. That Sheep says we pay as leaseholders, appalling job, not adequately inspected, gaps between seals and sash, no seal at top, lots of paint splashed onto seals, and so on. So I think her basic question is, should building of regs approval be needed, and should the local authority have pressure tested the draft seals?
Well, there's no requirement for local authorities to pressure test things, but a good industry standard would make them test it. And if you're going to say to Mrs. Smith, we're going to make your building more airtight, you might expect them to demonstrate that they've done it at the end of the job, mightn't you? Actually, pretty much all work that you do to buildings, and particularly to sensitive buildings in places like Hope Valley, is subject to building regulations. But unfortunately, as we've seen from the Grenfell review, there's been a long saga over 20 years of government trying to disengage from building regulations, deregulate, leave it to the industry, hand things over to self-certification by builders, and so on. And so there's not a lot of trust or confidence we can put in the building control authorities at the moment. I think there are some very good local authority building control officers. They're mostly just doing house extensions these days, and they don't get much backup from central government, or at least until the Grenfell inquiry they didn't. So I think we need to, my view is we need to reinforce building control. After the Grenfell fire, I was employed as a consultant with a colleague called Catherine Maybe, the same person I mentioned earlier, to look at what was done around the world about fire standards and building regulations in buildings, in high-rises in particular. And what we discovered, amongst many other interesting things, was that England is the only place in the world where builders are allowed to self-certify their work under the building regulations. And many other countries, when we contacted them as part of this research, couldn't believe that that's what we were doing in England. And they, their view was you have to have an independent third party inspect and certify the work. So we're a long way from good practice and best practice here. You'll find that there are many helpful local authority building control officers, but they're very under-resourced. Long gone are the days when they drive around looking for skips and builders trucks in order they can check on what's going on. But we do need to do that. And there is a sort of move back to making the building regulations have a bit more teeth and start to control quality a bit better. And that's what Each Home Counts was about. It's about having, well, it's what Trustmark is about. A famous retrofitter called David Adams from Melius Homes made the point during Each Home Counts that the Trustmark, Quality Mark people have to have teeth. They have to be as scary as the health and safety executives so that builders make sure they get it right, because if they don't, and the Trustmark guy shows up, they'll be out of the job. So we haven't got there yet either, but we have to do this balancing, as we were talking about before. We need a helpful but sharp-teethed, helpful but powerful regulatory regime. Whether we'll get it back, I don't know.
As we're on more than, thank you, that's wonderful. As we're on more than one screen, if you could use the reaction button, if you'd like to ask a question, and then if you click on the reaction button, there's a raised hand button, and you can put your hand up to ask a question.
There are some questions in the chat, Zizi.
To come in. Oh, is there a possibility for do-it-yourself homeowner? That was one of the things I was wondering, that the retrofit coordinator, as the regulations are developed, oversees, commissions the builders, oversees them, checks them off and signs off and says they're done to quality. But what if the person only wants the plan and then wants to do the work themselves, or can't afford the retrofit coordinator to oversee it and wants to get their own builders?
Well, the whole framework of standards is published and can be consulted, some of it in printed form, some of it online. British standards are a bit expensive. There's lots of guidance from organizations like the Retrofit Academy, for example, and the Passive House Trust, and so on. And so it is, I think, perfectly possible for people to work on their own homes or get work done on their own homes, but to use the standards and tell their team, I need you to do it to this standard, I need you to do it to that standard. It's only when you want to actually formally claim compliance from Trustmark, so you've got a piece of paper that certifies that the work is compliant with the standards, that you need to go through the whole rigmarole. In the meantime, people who have got the time and energy to do it are perfectly at liberty to adopt standards themselves, or indeed in organizations like Hope Valley Climate Action, get together and maybe, you know, over a few years, employ a retrofit coordinator intermittently between you to do work on more than one project at once, and, you know, work together to find the right builders and the right installers of measures and the right heat pumps and the right solar panels and so on, and get hold of, I mean, most of the technical guidance these days is online. So if, for instance, you wanted to find out technical guidance about internal wall insulation, it's there, it's online, you can find that. So I think there are lots of homegrown ways of doing it yourself. And I have to say that all the best retrofits done so far in the last 25 years have been done by people to their own homes. And there's a whole team of people who I think of as great retrofitters with lots of experience. They're mostly old and grey like me, but over the years they've done their own retrofit, and that's why they're good at it. They've thought about every detail. So the last thing I would want to do through standards and frameworks and things is discourage people from doing their own retrofit. But just be aware there's plenty of good guidance out there now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's good to hear, because yes, I certainly have a friend who said, the heat pump installer I got seemed to know less about heat pumps than I did from just a little bit of research. So you're right that the homeowner often takes more interest in their own home than in the amount of outside experts.
And if it's your own home, you're going to take care to get a heat pump person who knows what they're doing, and to take advice from your colleagues and neighbours and so on. If you're using funding from a program, whether it be the local authority or the local energy hub or from ECO or whatever, you're more likely to get dumped with an installer who you wouldn't choose yourself. So that's where you have to be really careful, that the cowboys come with the programs rather than commissioned by you.
I see somebody's asking about the flow chart detailing the process. At what point in the process does the assessor provide an estimated cost for the works? In our case, we'd be needing to apply for loans to carry out any work, and we need to factor this in. We've got a 1910 stone-built farmhouse currently heated by coal, Rayburn.
Okay, sounds expensive. Basically, you need a good assessment before you can get anywhere, because on the basis of the assessment, you determine through the improvement option evaluation and the medium-term plan what you're going to do. And only when you know what you're going to do to that dwelling, whose dimensions and characteristics you know, are you able to get realistic prices for it. So there is a certain amount of upfront investment in getting that information together. A colleague of mine says the quality of your assessment and its detail will be reflected in the quality of your retrofit at the end of the day. So in other words, you can't manage what you don't measure. It's essential to make sure you've got a good understanding of what the building is and how it is before you go ahead. You will get prices and they'll probably come in too high. The work I'm doing with Savills at the moment, we're getting in prices for retrofit that are between 50 and 100% higher than we expected at the beginning of the projects. And that seems to be because of all the inflation we've got at the moment, combined with a great shortage of installers who are any good. So the installers who are good they've got plenty of work, so they're putting in high prices on the basis that they don't really need the work. And if they get it at that price, well, that's great for them. So at the moment, I think the circumstances of pricing are a bit artificial. Whether they'll come down again or not, I don't know. But the other side of that, of course, is that the energy prices go up. Although that's very bad if we're struggling to pay our bills and keep warm, it's also very good for showing what the return on investment from retrofit is, because we get a lot more back if it was going to cost us a lot more to heat the house without it. You see what I mean?
Yes, indeed. I hope that that is part of what drives retrofit to become out of a niche of the climate activist into the sort of majority and wide scale. So thank you. Alan,
I'm sure I saw a hand, but it's gone.
Yes, Alan Thompson.
Ah, there it is. Yes.
Would you like to ask a question?
Sorry, who's that?
Alan, you?
Okay, yep. Bit academic this, but I'm at an age now, mid to late 70s, just about to pass the average age of my parents when they died. Where's the incentive for me to do anything? And just to raise that point, I've just been doing some calculations that 13% of the housing stock is owned by people over 65. So unless we get an incentive, there's a big chunk of that environmental strain is not going to be relieved by us not doing anything with our homes because we can't see a return.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm in a similar position myself. I think the first part of the answer is doing things for sustainability is not for us. It's for our children and our grandchildren. And it's about what kind of a world we hand to them, isn't it? So I think it's more about being responsible custodians of the environment and handing it forward in a better condition than we started with. So that would be the motivation I would claim. I think the other thing is that there are going to be subsidies. They're probably not for senior homeowners, I'm afraid. From looking at what current government are saying, they're talking about grants for fuel poor households and low income households and low cost loans for more able to pay households, which I guess we would all fall into in many cases. So, and low cost loans don't look very attractive if you think you might only be around to pay them for another few years. So I think we haven't got a political framework at the moment that will give us what we need to make sure everything gets done. However, I think that as things get worse, there will be more incentive on everybody's part to do something about it. I was just talking to someone this morning about the fact that after COP26, the politicians who were all over it and wanting to look good have sort of evaporated and aren't being seen anymore, which just reinforces my view that it's actually grassroots groups like yours, but perhaps also recruiting younger members that have got to do this stuff and get it going. I'm not sure whether that's a good answer, but that's
well, I think the point you make there is that probably over time, government will be forced to address it anyway.
Yes, provided it's not too late.
Yeah, probably will be for me.
And if they decide to stick to their, their legally binding commitment of 2050, but that's a long way off. I hope we get there much sooner for the planet's sake, if anything else. I'll take one question from the chat and then I'll give Michael a chance to ask a question, sorry. The question on the chat is MVHR, which is
mechanical ventilation with heat recovery.
That's right, the silver bullet to solve ventilation.
I would say no. I mean, I'm in many ways a ventilation specialist because I'm a risk specialist in retrofit. And actually, the trouble with mechanical ventilation with heat recovery is that it's too complicated and it doesn't fit into small dwellings very well at all. You need quite a lot of ductwork, one per room, and a couple of extras in the house, which can be quite consumptive of space. You need a heat exchanger and a fan box, which they seem to be getting bigger all the time, the size of big fridges not long ago, and there are even bigger ones now. And when we did Retrofit for the Future, quite a lot of occupants rebelled and said they weren't having all this kit in their house. What I use for ventilating in Retrofit is what's called centralized mechanical extract ventilation. And we use a French system called ERICO, which is demand controlled. So it ventilates every room individually according to how humid, how much moisture there is in the room. So when somebody's been using the shower or drying laundry, or there's a party going on or whatever it might be, there's more humidity in the room, and more people in the room, there's more humidity. And so the system delivers more fresh air and more extract ventilation. And it does it with half the ducts and about a quarter the fan size of an MVHR system. So my view is that for retrofit, we can't really afford to do MVHR. It's very difficult to commission, it's very difficult to balance, it's quite expensive, and it's quite hard to maintain. It requires filter replacements every 6 months and things like that. So we've been doing centralized mechanical extract ventilation, CMEV, instead of MVHR in retrofit, which is not to say that I'm against MVHR. I think that for new build dwellings, it's probably the perfect system. And you go into a modern new build passive house with an MVHR system in it, and the quality of the internal environment in terms of air quality, air movement, humidity, and certain temperature is wonderful. So it's definitely the right way to go for new build, but it just doesn't work for small, leaky 2 up, 2 down, or even 3 up, 3 down cottage type houses in the existing stock.
Oh, well, thank you. Michael, over to you now.
So I have a question first. Mike,
Oh, yeah.
are you the Mike Corcoran that used to be in the building industry?
Used to be in the where?
In the building industry? Or is it just a coincidence of name?
Yes, Peter.
Ah, okay.
Right, okay. So you'll need to concentrate on this one.
Okay. Yeah, you've got my attention now.
Peter, the PLAS 2035 quite appropriately focuses on the household. But I tend to look at these issues through the other end of the telescope and think about it from the national level, which you address in your talk. You talked of the need, even if we go the heat pump route, which is the route we'll probably take, we'll need something like 4 times the offshore capacity that we have at the moment. I think that's a severe underestimate. The offshore capacity we have at the moment is 11 gigawatts. and the 10-point plan is supposed to take us to 40 gigawatts by 2030. Whether we achieve that or not, I don't know. It actually is looking very promising at the moment. And I wonder whether you're talking about 4 times the total wind power, both onshore and offshore, because we have
Yes.
more
Yes.
onshore than we have offshore at the moment.
Stopped for a while because of kind of politics, but
Yeah.
yes, I am talking about total capacity. And actually, we don't have to do just for buildings 4 times as much wind power on or off. We have to do 4 times as much zero carbon power, which could also come from renewables or solar.
Yes. Yeah.
But that's where we've got to get to. And I think you're right. And I think those figures are probably a bit optimistic. That I've spent the last few months working for Savills, going to some really challenging housing estates, mostly in central urban areas, and realizing how much more difficult it's going to do well than we're really acknowledging in the way we're setting up standards and processes. So I think the figures are probably optimistic at the moment.
Right.
And personally, I don't think we're going to get there by 2050.
Well, I know, but there is I know, and I recognise that dilemma. But I always have at the back of my mind, if we fail to plan, we're planning to fail. So we have to be aiming at that.
And I think we don't give up the 2050 target. We must stick to it,
well,
just to make sure we keep the focus. You know?
Well, that's the very next point I was going to pick you up on. I think it's very misleading, actually, to talk about 2050 for a number of reasons. One is that in political terms, that's way off and allows for too much prevarication in between time. And it's not what is actually critical. What is critical is that we stay within our declared carbon budget, you know, a nationally determined contribution and a 6th carbon plan, which means that we've got the next 10 to 15 years to get things really sorted out, not to achieve net zero, but to be on the path. And that's a steep gradient of reduction to do that.
I think it's an S, Mike. You know, we're on the bottom, beginning to turn up now. We have to go up the steep bit, and then we can mop up the really difficult stuff a bit later.
Yeah, and none of these houses are going to be zero carbon until they've got
exactly
a zero carbon form of heat supplied to them.
Yeah.
Which really is my next point. When you talk about an average retrofit cost, and you did talk about between 10 and
12 and 15.
Dots, yes, yeah. Your average of 25,000. Are you including in your definition of retrofit the fitting of, let's say, in the majority of circumstances, the heat pump? Or are you talking about having your house in a state ready for that?
That's a whole house retrofit cost. And where it comes from is that mostly it's focused on housing stocks, that when you work down towards what the retrofit cost is likely to be from looking at large numbers of houses, it works out, it looks as though it's 25 grand. But what I've been doing over many years now is working upwards from assessments of lots and lots of homes in social housing stocks. So, you know, some thousands of dwelling types that we've created low carbon or zero carbon plans for, including the heat pumps and whatever needs to be done. And every time we finish a project, I ask our analyst, what's the average cost that you came up with, or we ended up with for this project, which might itself be a few tens of thousands of houses or just a few hundred. And every time she's answered me, it's been between 24,000 and 26,000.
So that's a house. Yeah,
that's using real prices for real houses and real improvements, as it were.
With its heat pump fitted, waiting for the day that the electricity supply has got a zero carbon intensity.
That's right. And so I'm pretty confident, having gone round that loop so many times, and many of my colleagues like Russell Smith from Retrofit Works have done the same sorts of things. We all come up with 25,000 as a good average, but we always try and warn that 25,000 might be the average, but your house might be at one end of the spread, might be nearer the 50 or might be nearer the 12.
So what we do know, and past 2035 anticipates it, is this work is likely to be phased, because we know that we only have capacity at the moment to fit something like 30,000 heat pumps a year under MCS registered installers. So there's a long way to go before we can actually get that up to scale. And the government is anticipating 600,000 by 2028.
I think they're very optimistic.
Again, optimism is yeah.
We need to have it.
Yeah, yeah. It would be good. It would be good to see a plan which corresponds to it.
I think, Michael, that the biggest block at the moment is actually the capacity of the installer, the installation industry. We used to think it was the capacity, it was funding, but I don't think it's really going to be funding. We used to think it was retrofit coordinators. I think we're going to have plenty of those. It's actually having suitably trained and skilled and experienced installers of particularly the complex measures, heat pumps, ventilation systems, EWI. Those are the things that are going to slow us down in the early years. Yeah. And somehow we have to attract people into those vocations and keep them there.
Yeah. And the last point that I want to come to, and actually it's really central to the whole issue, is the law of diminishing returns. As we phase our work, as is likely to be the case, the further we go, the less return we will have on the money that is to be spent. And we will end up with a heat pump, which until very recently, and maybe even now, will cost a great deal of money and will save no money at all. Because at the moment, at the present, the relative costs of gas and electricity, that will change. We know that will change, but that's not the situation at the moment. And until it changes significantly, it's a huge disincentive for people to take the step.
I agree. In fact, we do have a tariff review now announced for this year. And it's one of the things that many of us have been pushing for a year or more now, that actually at the moment, all the subsidies are on gas and all the levies to do retrofit with are on electricity, which is the exact inverse of where we need it to be. So we're all pinning our hopes on the tariff review coming out to reverse that situation. Personally, I wouldn't hold my breath. I think that the tariff review will get got at by lots of people in the industry who want to keep things the way they are. So we have to be quite vigilant about that. So I think that's certainly the case. I think the law of diminishing returns, we already have a mechanism for starting to deal with that, which is that the government's proposal, though it isn't official yet, is that to use sticks and carrots. So essentially the carrots will be some financial subsidies and loans and grants and things like that. But the sticks will be things like a minimum EPC rating or SAP rating that you must achieve in your house before you can sell it. And those minimum standards being stepped up every 5 years and pre-announced many years in advance. And the idea is that that would then price in to the industry the cost of improving the dwelling up to the next stage before you sell it.
And the indications are that that would add value to the property, or at least that's the argument that's being advanced.
You haven't seen it yet, though.
I need to cut in, Michael, because I'm sure you've got plenty more questions, but I must get other people. There's been at least 3 times as many questions in the chat as hands up. So I'm going to take some chat questions, but I will come back to you, Alan. Just turn alarm off. So in the chat, somebody's asked about getting an initial assessment. Where was it? Anyway, I can say that in this area, our best person is Nick Parsons. He's not a retrofit coordinator qualified, but he's been in the building trade many years. But a few days ago on his website, he was saying he's booked up until next Christmas. So I don't know where one gets a retrofit coordinator for that initial assessment in any soon, but you can answer that. The other question is, are new builds needing to be zero carbon? So I'll let you answer both of those, and then I'll take another question.
The shortage of professionals is really, really difficult. What you need to start with is a retrofit coordinator, but I don't think there's going to be a shortage of them for very much longer. We're training a lot of them, although they're not many of them super experienced and confident yet. What you need to start with is a retrofit assessment, of your property. And one of the things we've been trying to get government to do, and which the Construction Leadership Council's National Retrofit Strategy proposes, is splitting off assessment from doing the work. So subsidizing everybody getting their home assessed, so that we've got a whole load of assessments and we've raised people's expectations of what can be done and what they need to have done, and given them a better idea of what it might cost. And we create a pipeline of work for the installers, for the industry, looking ahead, so they will invest in the training and skills they need. So the idea of splitting the two has been around for a while. It doesn't seem to have much traction with BEIS at the moment. I think it's a bit too scary for them. I'm afraid that with this government, retrofit is a kind of toxic thing politically, because they had their fingers so badly burned with the Green Deal, and then with the Green Deal voucher scheme, Green Home Grants voucher scheme, and so on, that their backbenchers are saying to them, there's no votes in this, it's just getting us to look bad. So we're in a politically difficult situation with that one. That was the first question. Remind me of the second one, Zizi.
Well, there was the question about, whether new builds are required to be zero
yes.
carbon.
Yeah, thank you. New builds aren't required to be zero carbon, and it's absolutely insane that what we're doing at the moment is driving forward huge amounts of political effort to try and get to 375,000 new homes a year, which are not zero carbon and are a long way from zero carbon, and will have to be retrofitted between now and 2050 if we're going to have a zero carbon housing stock. The Future Homes Standard, which is due to be introduced in 2025, might address that. And the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI, has been doing quite a lot of work on what that standard needs to look like. It won't be announced perhaps for another 18 months, 2 years, what that standard needs to look like, so that we're delivering new build. Because adding to the burden, I mean, that 5 a minute that I mentioned in my talk is just to do the existing houses. Adding more new homes that also have to be retrofitted would increase that number. So it's clearly insane to do that. But the politics of the situation are that the house building industry has a lot of oomph, a lot of kick when it comes to what politicians are and are not prepared to do.
Thank you. I'll take Alan next. What's your question? You'll need to unmute. Yes.
Right. Well, yeah, I suppose for me, it's sort of wondering what's going to be the thing that's going to kick me off down this path. So, 25,000, assume that, an awful lot of money to spend all in one go. I do DIY, so maybe I could buy some rolls of rock wool and throw more down in the loft and try and do a bit under the floor that I've got access to downstairs. But I've already got, the basic levels of insulation. I've got the cavity walls done a long time ago. It's easy just to sit and just wait and leave it. Or if somebody going to come to me and knock on the door and say, you need to get started. Like you say, it is complicated, easy to get wrong. I don't want to go and start trying to do something myself and mess things up and have wasted money. What was being said earlier, the idea to have everybody's house assessed, then at least you've got your assessment. Maybe then you can start doing it in phases. Then
Yes.
at a time, build it up over a period. So how's it all going to work? Because at the moment it just feels to me like the years are ticking by and nothing's happening, nobody's doing anything, and I just see it carrying on this way.
I think it's quite likely to, unless we have a different government, to be honest. There's been a remarkable lack of courage amongst politicians to grasp this problem and help us drive it forward. I would say that to help you with the confidence thing, that's what retrofit coordinators are for. They're supposed to work for you, the client, not for the installers. And they're supposed to represent your interests, look after your interests and protect them, and make sure you get the right retrofit and get the right expertise into the situation. So I think we need to get to a point where every town and village has got its local friendly retrofit coordinator who knows how to do it. There are some places that have got those. It's where the better ones happen to live, but there are organizations starting to set up networks of retrofit coordination to help give people confidence. And then the other side of the kickstart, of course, is the minimum energy efficiency standards, where if you have to get it to an EPC B by 2030 and maybe maybe to, you know, halfway to an A by 2040, that sort of starts to make you think about the value of the house, what you could get for it, whether it's worth investing at this stage, what someone might be prepared to pay for it, and all those kinds of things.
I probably only
So-
think you can be selling it, I guess. I don't suppose there'll be fines if you don't get on with the work. You know,
Well, you have to do maintenance and so on anyway, don't you? And of course, there will be a situation, perhaps 20 years down the line, where a lot of homes have been improved and they're sort of scattered through the marketplace, and they're probably going to be more attractive, especially in a MEES environment where there are standards to meet, than the ones that haven't been improved, because people will pay more for the ones that have been improved and less for the ones that still need improving. So I think the market will get transformed slowly. And as somebody was saying, it's a kind of S-curve that we have to go up. You know, we have to just get our heads down and get on with it. And once we get the momentum going, it will build, and people will see what's going on, skills and confidence will develop and so on, and we'll be able to start moving at scale and at speed. And there'll be a few homes towards the end that are really difficult, and we leave them and we put more time and effort into them at the end of the program.
yeah, I mean, I don't know, like say a fairly ordinary home like this is an ex-council house, you know, the next step would be external cladding on the walls. And there's some around here that council owned which have done that. I've got no idea how successful it was, whether it caused mold or what, but
Well, there is some work being done at UCL, at University College London, that suggests that actually if you filled the cavities, that's probably good enough. There are some places where you might not want to go for external wall insulation or internal wall insulation, where you accept that the cavity fill is going to get you a U value in the wall of 0.5 or something, and then you size your heat pump to cope with that. And there's actually nothing wrong with saying I'm going to have a bigger heat pump, provided we can build enough wind turbines to support enough bigger heat pumps. But it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And in fact, relatively modern cavity wall dwellings are amongst the hardest, because filling the cavity strictly isn't good enough. You want a U value of 0.3 in the wall, not 0.5. So we need to halve the heat losses again. But is it really worth, you know, 10 grand to do external wall insulation? Probably not. Probably just a bigger heat pump might do the work. Bit of draft stripping, better ventilation system, and so on.
yeah, okay.
Well, that's fascinating that a modern building can be harder to retrofit than an old one, because many of us in the Hope Valley are in old buildings, and I always thought that we all had the difficult ones.
I think we've all got the difficult ones, at whatever age they are. You know, there aren't any easy retrofits in my view. And actually, one of the things I've learned recently is if you get it wrong, you know, bad retrofit is worse than no retrofit. So that used to be treated as heresy when I said that, but I'm now utterly confident that it's true. I've seen some really bad retrofit recently, and I've realized that they left the home worse than it was before. So that's why we need to be careful, and we need to apply standards. And you know, I'm completely with Alan, being cautious about what he's going to set out to do.
Well, I thought it was fairly obvious that bad retrofit would be worse, because you could get moisture and then mold build up, and then you could have dry rot and destroy the whole fabric of the building.
And the health of the occupants, and the appearance of the building as well. You know, it can be disastrous if it's done badly. There's no doubt about it.
Was that your question completed, Alan?
Yeah, it's really about that. You know, I want to do something, I want to get started, but obviously it's probably a lot more complicated than I thought, or too many things that could go wrong. Still, I would have to have that assessment first, really.
Well, I think you need a friendly retrofit coordinator first. And I do know a few. I could probably send a few names that you could try and see how we go from there.
Oh, that would be useful. We're gradually in the energy group trying to get a list of good traders, because we're having an eco open homes day each year to show what we've to show other people what we've all done, those of us who have, and so gradually hope to then get a list of useful people. Because the problem is, the people we find, then you go back to them and they say, sorry, my order book's full.
Yeah, sure. And that's going to be a problem for a while. Well, that's why I was thinking before that if we could find, say, 2 or 3 good retrofit coordinators who aren't too far from Hope Valley, they could be your panel, if you like, and people could use them as appropriate, rather than everybody hunting around on their own to find someone.
Indeed, indeed. And I mean, I think the pandemic has particularly exacerbated things, because people who used to spend money on exotic foreign holidays have just recently been instead spending their money on a fancy new bathroom or something, generally not to do with retrofit, but still using the building skills that could be used for other, there's a lot of these people are multi-skilled, aren't they? So I'll take another couple of questions from the chat. Jeremy says, won't a good retrofit increase the value and hence sale price of the house? And Pamela says, when will the government require an energy performance certificate of grade C or above? Will it be required before we sell or rent out our homes? Now, you said that will come in, but do you have any idea of the timescale when the government will require grade C?
I think when they get the confidence and the political wherewithal to do it, they're already requiring EPC C, the bottom of C though, by 2030 for social housing, and their aspiration is by 2035 for all of the rest of housing. But there are no rules or legislation to support that yet, but time to achieve that. I mean, they need to give people a good few years notice if they're going to set a standard like that. So I think it will happen, and it will happen during this decade is what I would suggest.
Yes, they've been talking about a standard for private rented, but have not actually brought it in yet, so far as I'm aware.
Well, they're revising the decent home standard for private rented at the moment, and they're trying to plug the energy standards into that to get them. But private landlords are, well, apologies to any of you who are private landlords, but private landlords as a group are notorious for pushing back against energy standards, mostly because private landlords are mostly very small stockholders. They've got 1 or 2. I think the average holding amongst private landlords is 5. So they're not like big housing organizations. They're more people who do it in their spare time.
Yes, and then you get the whole range. You get the person who just lets out one house so they can live off the income, who might be a very concerned landlord. And as you say, you think in the bad ones and everything in between. What about Jeremy's question of, does a good retrofit increase the value of your house?
Well, it should do. And in an environment where those kind of minimum energy efficiency standards on sale or rental were in place, it definitely would do. The RICS have been working with a lot of European money, actually, for quite a long time now, on trying to factor in energy efficiency in the form of energy ratings or EPCs into valuations, into mortgage valuations. And they are making slow but steady progress with that. It's a difficult thing because normally you expect the surveyor to be able to see something which affects his valuation. And the problem with energy efficiency is you can't really see it. You can see the insulation, you can see the heat pump, but what you really want to know is, well, what effect does it have on the fuel bills? And I think we will get there, actually. As all these things start to happen, the factor of how energy efficient is it will start to influence the market. And I think the MEES thing, pricing in the need to do the improvements, is probably the most potent of those.
And then there's a follow-up to Pamela's question. She was asking about the energy performance C before renting or selling. And Courtney says, if we are required to have these certificates for renting or selling, is it possible to get a DIY retrofit rated? She heard from a friend who said he DIY'd it, his house himself, and was above the required specification, but told to get certified at a particular rating, he had to have it all redone by a builder. Now, I thought that your energy performance certificate, nobody ever has asked me who's done the work to get my energy performance certificate rating. So
I think you're right that provided the house is in a given condition, it should get the rating. Yeah, it doesn't have to be done by a professional builder, but it obviously has to be done well and properly. But there's plenty of DIYers who are capable of doing that. I think that there's a deeper problem, which is that EPCs are created using a piece of software called Reduced Data SAP, or RD SAP, and it has defaults in it for some of the things like insulation and so on. And those defaults depend on the age of the dwelling. And so if you want to say, well, actually, I've put insulation, I've got more insulation now, you've got to provide some evidence as to how much insulation you've got and what effect it's had. And a lot of EPC assessors can't be bothered to find out how thick your wall insulation is and what it's made of and all that kind of thing. They just go for the default. So you can find that some improvements make no difference to the EPC, which is clearly ludicrous. So again, we're sort of working on that. There's a review of RD SAP going on at the moment, being run by BRE. And I hope that we'll get a slightly more sensitive way of assessing dwellings out of it. But at the moment, PAS 2035 doesn't allow the use of RD SAP except for collecting data. It requires all the improvement option evaluation assessments to be done with full SAP, so we can take full account of all the elements of the building. But that was itself very controversial for the industry.
So in the meantime, I think if your friend is having a problem, I'd tell him to pick a different energy performance assessor.
Yes, or challenge what they've done.
EPCs, because there seem to be plenty of them out there. One person asked, what can I expect to pay for a retrofit assessment? And while you're answering that, I'll also ask, I thought the retrofit assessor was the one, not qualification, the one person in the chain that the government was thinking of taking out, that it would go straight from coordinator to designer and that wouldn't be an assessor. But yes, do answer both of those.
Well, there's no plan to take the assessors out. Everybody accepts that we absolutely have to have assessments. And as Colin King said, the quality of your assessment is reflected in the quality of your retrofit. So the more you know about the building, the better. I think there is an argument being made, but not necessarily being won, to separate the assessments from the delivery. And I think that would be a good thing. But there's certainly no move to remove the assessors. What they've done is remove the advisors, the people who give energy advice from to the householder or the landlord at the inception of the project, when the improvement option evaluation has been done, and at handover when it's been finished. And they haven't removed the requirement to give advice from PAS 2035. It's just that there were no suitable qualifications for retrofit advisors. There were, the only qualifications around were City and Guilds qualifications focused on fuel poverty in social housing. So we decided to take the requirement for the qualification of the advisor out of the standard, which we did at the end of last year in the amendment published in January. But we're now, I've just made a list of things that are going to happen in this year's update, and we're going to put advisors back because some people have got together and created a much more robust and appropriate retrofit advisor training course and qualification. So we're going to put the advisors back into the system, which is going to cause all sorts of consternation having just taken them out, but that's the way things go, isn't it?
Oh, well, that's great to hear. And what can somebody expect to pay?
Good question. More than you want. I don't think it's worth beating about the bush. You know, I think that a decent retrofit assessment should be costing you 400 quid. And it's nothing like an EPC assessment. With EPC and with those kinds of things, Green Deal assessments, there was a race to the bottom. And the cost of assessment went down and down from 150 to 120 to 80 to 60 to 40 pounds. And you pay for what you get, you know, you get what you pay for. So I think we have to just bite the bullet and say, you know, it's an average of probably 400 quid for each household to get a decent, properly documented, standardized and uploaded retrofit assessment. And if we do that split to lead with the assessments, that's why we need to subsidize the assessments, because that's 400 quid that doesn't give you any payback immediately until you deliver something. So consequently, I think the subsidy has to go on that 400 somehow. But there's nobody in Bays wants to hear that at the moment.
Well, that's cheaper than the People Power Retrofit in Manchester are charging were charging, no, actually it wasn't People Powered Retrofit, it didn't exist. Its predecessor, the Carbon Co-op, was charging a flat £500 for a normal 3-bedroom semi. So 400 is, less than that.
Well, it's a ballpark figure, isn't
so-
it? I know that the Carbon Co-op people charge around that, but that's the middle of the range, really. Some bigger ones, they're charging 900, 1,000, and some smaller ones a bit less. I think 400 is probably a good average, and the price will go down as the volume goes up. When we've got people who can build a career doing retrofit assessments, and they can do, several a week, the price will come down a bit, and we just have to get the volume to achieve that. I think we've exhausted everyone's easy.
No. Oh, well, actually, we are running out of time. We're supposed to have finished. But there is one more question from Alan. If landlords now have to meet Band C, might they achieve that work done now only with the government, only for the government up to standard B or A later, requiring yet more retrofitting later? Oh, I think it's saying if it's in stage things, are some landlords likely to only go as far as C and then do more later?
Well, they'll have to do more later to get to zero carbon, because EPC C, the bottom of Band C, is SAP 69. We need them in the SAP 90s to get zero carbon. So they will have to do more later. It is the first stage. They will have to meet the PAS standard if they're using public money from one of the schemes like ECO or Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund or Local Authority Delivery to do that work. If they're using their own resources, they don't have to even meet the standard. And the key thing is to try and prevent them from doing stuff to get the cheapest, nastiest way to EPCC, which then blocks you from doing other things. I mean, I looked at some houses the other day that have got 50mm thick external wall insulation on them, and they need to be 100 or 150 thick. But I can't find a way of topping that up. We're going to have to take it off and do it again. And that's exactly the sort of situation we don't want to get into, which is why PAS 2035 requires people to have a medium-term plan so that they can do things in a sort of orderly manner and in a sensible order and to the right standards at each stage.
But presumably you could do something like loft insulation without getting this £400 assessment.
Yeah, well, loft insulation, I used to think loft insulation was done and was easy and there were no risks, but I've been disabused of that view. You can go on topping it up, but you have to be very careful to maintain ventilation across the uninsulated cold loft. And that means you have to make sure you don't block the ventilation at the eaves, or you replace it with ventilation above the insulation line somewhere else. And if you don't do that, you get lots of condensation in your loft and all the timber rots. So even with loft insulation, it can go badly wrong if you're not careful.
Okay.
In principle, you can top it up, and we have been, but there are limits.
Okay. Well, I'll let Michael ask the very last question, but only one question this time, Michael, because we are a bit over time already and we must finish quite soon.
I do have the last question, but before I ask it, just my personal thanks to you, Peter, for giving up your evening to us here this evening. Very much appreciated. Well, my last very straightforward question. Under a phased programme of work, is the evaluation done at the end of each phase?
Well, if you are, yes, you're dividing your work into separate projects, possibly spaced apart by some years, then you do evaluate at each stage. Each stage would have its own intended outcomes. And at each stage, there would be an evaluation, which in principle should show that the intended outcomes were achieved and there were no unintended consequences. And in fact, the evaluation process and its escalation when things go wrong is designed to be a deterrent. It's designed to let the installation industry know that if they get it wrong, they're going to be in for time and money putting things right. So they might as well get it right first time. So yes, it does apply at each stage of the work. You can't really do project and then wait 2 years and then do another project, then wait and then do the evaluation in 2045 or something. That wouldn't be the spirit of the thing. The point of the thing is to check that we're doing what we said. And for me, it's a very simple principle. Here's an industry doing things to people's homes. People's homes are probably their biggest investments and quite important to them. And we ought, as an industry, to be doing what we say we will, and then showing that we've done it at the end. Any industry with it worth its salt would be it contacts its customers, sends them a questionnaire, says, how did we do? And the retrofit industry is no different from any others, in my view. It needs to do that. So we've tried to keep the first stage of the evaluation very quick. It's a questionnaire that asks those simple questions of the customer to give us some feedback.
And of course, it could also inform a modification for the staged plan.
Well, and also for things that went wrong, maybe in the next project, we specify it slightly differently, or we use a different installer or whatever. There's lots of lessons to be learned because this is a new process. We're using new materials, new products, new systems, new processes, and new skills to do things that we haven't done really before at any scale to buildings. So we need to keep the learning loop in place all the time, as much as we can.
And each house is a little bit unique. You can't just say, oh, well, usual houses, this works for. You have to think, does it work for this particular one? So I will wind up now. Thank you, Peter. It's been really interesting. I could have gone on asking questions till the cows come home, and I'm sure others of us will. It's been wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk, and thank you all for staying so long. I mean, we're sort of we're nearly 2 hours in, so I'm really impressed.
I completely overlooked the 8:30 mark when we were supposed to finish. I got so engrossed, but thank you for staying, and thank you for those people who have stayed. I see we've reduced somewhat, but yes, lovely. And the recording is available for everybody later. So yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you very much, Peter.
If people have got real burning questions they still want to ask, my email address is on the last slide, so they could look at it on the website and send me a question. And if it's a question that requires several days' work to answer, I'll send them a quote. And if it's an easy one to answer, I'll just reply. So we'll go from there.
Well,
okay, thank you. And
thank you
good
very,
night.
very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for staying late. It was, as I say, I got engrossed and didn't notice.